like it. You want a podcast like it? Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. Just podcast like it. Podcast like it's 1999. Podcast like it. You want a podcast like it's 1999.
Hello and welcome to Podcast Like It's 2009, the podcast where we talk about the films of 2009 from Mars here in 2022. I'm one of your hosts, Kenny Nybar.
And I am Jalisco.
And with us back again is Tom Mison, our good friend, and he also starred in a show that has the same name as this movie.
Is tangentially connected, feels like, to the Watchmen universe?
In a roundabout way.
In a roundabout way.
Which one is tangentially connected?
Well,
it is.
Watchmen I remember, and I'm sure, Tom, you discussed this at length with Damon when the show was happening. But Damon kind of refused to call it a sequel and didn't really want to call it a reboot and wanted to call it like a remix or something along those lines. So I don't say this with any judgment because I rewatched the entire series before this as well, and it really goes out of its way to be its own animal. You know what I mean? Like, it does not want to conform in any way to canon or what have you.
I think that's the way that Damon thought he could respect it the most.
Yes,
and I agree. Don't try and interfere with what Alan Moore done.
But I think that the comic or the graphic novel is canon for the show.
Yes.
He doesn't interfere with it in any way, but it is canon, and this is a continuation of that Squid and all.
Yeah, we had the first time I spoke to him, it was a long discussion about that, and he said absolutely 100%. Alan Moore's comic is the Bible.
It's a Squid Game.
The Squid Game.
Indeed.
But fortunately, what was it called? Doomsday? They did other comics.
They did
a crossover with other DC characters.
Yeah.
And, fortunately, nothing to do with anything.
Kind of nothing. Yeah, exactly.
About now.
Kind of not connected in any. I mean, it really just felt like a cash grab, quite frankly. It just didn't really feel as it was a sequel. Like, it was the continuing stories of some of these characters many years later. To what end? I'm not sure.
It was just to see what would happen if Dr. Manhattan could fight Superman.
Yeah,
that's the only reason for it, really.
Yeah, true. Here is my question to you, Tom. You obviously read this graphic novel. When did you read the graphic novel, and you saw this film in 2009? I'm assuming as well.
I saw it in the cinema in 2009. I saw it in the ArcLight in LA.
Los Angeles. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
As did I, Tom.
As did I. So we all
did. You?
Look at that. Yeah. Yes.
Good grief. We could have been sitting next to each other.
We might have been. Who
without
knows?
knowing.
I saw it at midnight and opening night.
Oh wow! Really?
Did you?
Hardcore. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Was it worth staying up for?
Yeah, that's a long movie for that.
I mean, full disclosure, I love this film. Love.
Okay.
So yes, I had no concept upon leaving that theater that it would be as unevenly received as it was. I really thought people would be into it, but
yeah,
some are.
I knew straight away that it would
it'd be divisive,
would not satisfy everyone, because I went with about 8 or 9 British actors in LA, which is something I desperately try to avoid when I'm in Los Angeles, is to hang around with fucking British actors.
Me too.
I like to pretend. I like to pretend that I'm something exotic over there. And when I see my own kind, I realize I'm just a pale version of them. And by the end of the film, I was the only one left. The entire row of British actors had gone, except for my girlfriend at the time, who only stayed because I forced her to.
Why did they leave?
Because they thought it was shit, Kenny.
Why did they think it was shit? And do you think it's shit?
I don't think it's shit. I've never thought it was shit. I I think.
Did these people know the source material out of curiosity? Were they fans of the comic? Okay, so
I first read it when I was about 16 or 17, and I was very angry and very left, and it satisfied the angry late teenager turn of the century Tom. And then I read it again a few years ago before I even knew that there was a series being made. It was just a coincidence. After I had become a father, and it didn't make me angry. It made me unbelievably sad. Yeah, really sad. Yeah. And I think I could read it again now, and it would have a different feeling. And in 20 years' time, it could have another feeling. In that way, it's like Hamlet.
So I'll give my quick thing with this movie and this property. I've read one graphic novel in my life, and it is Watchmen. Yes.
Really?
It is not that, and comic books are not a medium that I find that engagement. Right? I find panel reading and comic dialogue to be a little opaque for me.
Now tell me, is that uncommon with writers over there?
Well,
to not have any interest in comics, because it seems though a lot of the although to be fair, I've only done more genre-leaning stuff, but lots of writers seem to be really interested in comics.
We can talk about this a little bit because I think it's interesting. When we were kids, so in the 80s, and this is not opinion, this is fact. DC and Marvel were dead. DC and Marvel.
A friend of mine was offered shares in Marvel in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. And he was a massive comic book fan and was offered to buy shares really cheap. And he said, it's a safe bet. And now he would be unbelievably wealthy. You've frozen, and it's my fault. You're frozen.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You're a little frozen.
We can hear you though.
We can hear you though. So it'll break up eventually.
In the 80s and 90s, DC and Marvel were not, obviously dead, but Marvel had gone bankrupt. And they were very fringy in the culture. Even nerd culture had gravitated towards things like Magic the Gathering, things like Pokemon. It really did, the superhero thing was dead. And occasionally things would happen like Batman, but that didn't feel like that was giving birth to like a bunch of superhero fans. That felt like that was another version of a popcorn movie.
You did have the niche stuff that you mentioned, like your Vertigo imprints and your stuff like that was doing sort of more esoteric stuff.
They were things, and Spawn certainly had its moment, and they made a movie out of it and made money. But these weren't like
Phantom
the things
Billy Zane, Phantom
Billy Zane, which was a serial, which was like a 30s serial, but they weren't imbuing the culture the way with kind of the superhero thing, the way I think pop television was and pop movies were. So for me,
Batman was still Batman, but I understand your point.
But Batman was definitely Batman, and Superman was definitely Superman. And aside from those guys, everything else was like super niche.
Correct.
So there's certainly many TV writers who grew up reading comic books and graphic novels, and probably had their own little crew of people who did that. But they did that in the dark. They did that they did that in the closet, so to speak.
I read comics in secret.
In secret, that's what I'm getting at. Like I think it was a guilty pleasure type thing for a lot of people. So I do think that
demographically, to your point, Kenny, like it does feel as though you weren't cool if you read comics in the 90s to some degree.
And you were in the 2000s. And I think that's also true for fantasy, right? I think that Harry Potter, changed the way kids approach fantasy, and Lord of the Rings movies did too. But in the 90s, if you were a Lord of the Rings person, if you were a Tolkien person, you were a fringy person. You had fringy tastes. Yeah. So I think to your point, I think that there are a lot of people who played catch up and got into comics in their 20s or 30s. And I think that there are a lot of people who never did. And Watchmen was always fascinating to me because Watchmen was discussed in the media that I read as high lit.
Well, that's why you, as a non-comic reader, approached.
My sense was there was something, and I always kind of had a thing for superheroes, particularly Batman, but I'm talking from the movies and from the animated series and things like that. But there's something about Watchmen that drew me in.
Well, I think also it should be said that Watchmen is the only comic/graphic novel on the Time 100 greatest novels of all time,
which is the exact catalyst for why I decided this is something that I feel like I should be reading. So I read it in the 2000s at some point. I was on Entourage at the time, so a bunch of us read it kind of together, and were able to talk about it, and that was awesome. And then this movie came out, and then we all saw it together. So I think I'm kind of the rare Watchmen fan or viewer who wasn't precious about it. Didn't kind of, hadn't read it in my youth or read it when I was more impressionable, and hadn't already kind of, dissected it and analyzed it ad nauseum. But I also wasn't coming in fresh. And I would imagine coming in fresh to this film a year after Dark Knight and Iron Man was probably really kind of.
Was it? Did it come just after Iron Man?
It did.
Yeah,
it was
Iron Man and Dark Knight were 2008.
2008.
And there was this idea, at least in the culture, I think, because I remember speaking to my young nephew at the time, where he's like, "Oh yeah, it's all superheroes now: Batman, Iron Man, Watchmen," where they were kind of grouped in, even though they're nothing like those mythology.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like. I mean, I had a somewhat similar experience with comics to Kenny to a certain degree. I wasn't a big comic book. I read comics to a little bit as a kid, but not a lot. I was drawn towards Watchmen for similar reasons because it was at this echelon that it felt like, other comics were not. It was closed off. One of the big problems I had with comics as a kid was I never knew where to jump in. I mean, you always have a lot of #1 issues to try to get people into different arcs and what have you, but it always just felt very just intimidating. There was just so much of it, and I just didn't know where my entry point would be. But, read Watchmen, really loved it. And, this property, this graphic novel, went through many iterations over the years in terms of development. There was a Terry Gilliam version of this. There was a Tim Burton version of this. There was a Paul Greengrass version.
It was going to be
an Aronofsky version,
with Johnny Depp playing the comedian.
Correct. Which is insane. And we're all better off that didn't happen. But I do feel like there was a Michael Bay version in 2003 as well. Like a lot of people kicked this around, and it was incredibly hard to adapt. We've all, anyone who's read the comic knows it's quite dense. It's got a lot going on in it. And you had different writers coming at it from different vantage points. But yes, Tom?
And to add to that, Damon Lindelof had been approached, he said, about seven or eight times to turn it into a TV show. But he never, ever wanted to do a straight up adaptation of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, and his entry point, which he's spoken to in interviews many times, is the racial element. He felt like once he read the Takeshi
Coates,
book, that was sort of the lightning bolt moment for him, where it was like, this is the thing to explore within this universe that felt obviously incredibly prescient, considering the world that we live in. But it's very interesting how many people tried to adapt this thing in many different ways, and ultimately what came down to it was a pretty slavish adaptation of the source material, with a 2 hour and 45 minute running time. it's kind of a beast. And I think that it was a little alienating to people. We'll talk about the box office in a minute, but I do think that, speaking to your friends that you went to see this film with, Tom, if I sat down in that theater without any context to what was going on, it's too much to really process, quite frankly.
Yeah, my wife, when I watched it the other night, lasted 20 minutes.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
And then she went, "Fuck this, I'm watching Selling Sunset."
but truthfully, like, I would imagine that it's also the type of thing that, if you're not a comic book person, this movie's just not going to work for you, period. But then on top of it all, you've got Dr. Manhattan showing dick through this whole movie, which a lot of people found a little bit, ridiculous in its own way.
But then other people felt like he wasn't showing enough dick.
There wasn't enough. Yeah, it's like, this is a movie that I do believe you're never going to make everyone happy. If ever there was
I'm
a
not
property,
even making a joke. Do you remember? Like, because he's naked in the entire comic book. So whenever he puts on that little G-string,
everyone's like, what the fuck?
Yeah. It's like,
This isn't what I paid for. I paid for Big Blue Dick, god damn it.
It's just really...
That's what I shouted at Blue Man Group.
I think it's just a very, very hard adaptation. And I think that I respect this adaptation, that they were able to, I remember, just for what it's worth, my boss at the time, my agent now, an enormous Watchmen fan, got to see an early screening of this film. And I asked him what he thought, and he's like, it's the best we're going to get. He's like, it's the best possible version of this comic, in the sense that this is the only version that probably gets into theaters, right? This is a version that I will talk about the flaws and the things that I don't necessarily love about it, but this is kind of the only one, that's possible.
So there is a discussion in here about when you're adapting for screen, how faithful do you need to be to the source material? Totally. Because this visually and with largely characterization is very faithful, but thematically, not at all. It misses the mark quite dramatically. Now, they're making their own film, and it's a different medium. It's why I never really like people saying it's not as good as the book about any film, because it's a different thing. So how slavishly should a film stick to its source?
I mean, that's a question that I literally asked myself within the first 20 minutes of this rewatch. Because Snyder was very clear.
How do we judge it? Do we judge it as a film on its own, or do we judge it as...
That's the thing, right? Where Snyder talked about using frames, using literally the graphic novel as a storyboard of his film. But I mean, Kenny, what do you think?
Well, there's the text, and there's the meta text, and then there's the extra text. And it's an interesting it's a great question, and I think it's as relevant to this film as any that I can think of. I said to Phil yesterday that if this was born of whole cloth, and if the comic book didn't exist, this would be one of the most revolutionary movies of the last 20 years. I think that its adherence to the comic book or the graphic novel cuts both ways. And when you say, and I know you're not looking for a skeleton key like answer, but how closely should you hew to the text when you're adapting? Well, there's no answer to that question, right? There's like the answer is, to me as a writer, whatever fucking gets you to the church on time, right? Like that's it's so hard to write a script or make a movie no matter what. And then whatever adaptation looks like and feels like for you that turns this piece into a filmed piece is the right answer. And in terms of this particular film, I don't think that there's a wrong or right answer about how you approach it as a viewer. If you want to put it up against the graphic novel, if that's how you approach this, that's fine. You can't turn that part of your brain off. For me, I thought it did everything the graphic novel did in its
Mm-hmm.
considering its runtime. And I do think thematically it's a lot closer to the graphic novel than you do. And I also think narratively and emotionally it's superior.
I'll say this in terms of me trying to answer your question, Tom, about how slavish you should be to an adaptation. As someone who relatively recently adapted a novel with another writer into a pilot, our goal was always to convey the essence of the source material. It was never to convey the tone and the themes and the characters, and to do the best we could to convey the feeling we felt when reading the source material. Now that's just how we approached it. But I think that yes, sir, go ahead.
I asked a similar question to a friend of mine over here who's a writer. We were talking about Blade Runner.
Sure.
And because I'd read not that long ago that Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford, and I can't remember who wrote it.
Oh God, what we know his name because we did the Minus Man. What was his name?
Yeah.
It's like, oh God, it's something. It's Hampton Fincher.
Fancher.
Yeah.
All have different opinions about whether Deckard is a replicant or not. So, who's right?
I mean,
when you're making a film, you've got the actor playing Deckard, you've got the writer, and you've got the director all saying different things.
But to your point, when you read stuff from Alan Moore talking about what he was attempting to do with the original graphic novel, he was specifically not looking for binary answers to things, right? I mean, he went out of his way to create something that was subjective. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that Zack Snyder is a particularly subjective filmmaker. I don't think he's particularly interested. This is one of my big problems with this film.
You mean ambiguous, right? Like
yes, exactly. I think he likes things to be black and white, or ironic, or deep, really, in any way.
I totally disagree with you guys.
I know, and that's fair. And
it's not that I'm like some Snyder head, and I just think
I know.
I think we've gotten it in our heads that he's the antithesis of smart elevated filmmaking, but I
disagree with that. I don't think that
I'm not be clear, I'm not suggesting that my point is, I don't think that with this film in particular, okay, he gets deep enough with it. That's just me.
I wonder whether he and David Hayter, who wrote the screenplay, had different ideas. And Alexei, whether they had different ideas.
Well, Hayter has a screenplay credit on this for a previous draft of the screenplay.
Oh, and it was Alex
drastically dissimilar. It was Alex and
it was
and
modern
Snyder.
Day. It was he had a
was it?
Yeah. Hayter had and he was going to direct it. That was a modern day retelling of the story.
I believe that
that's how I feel, Tom.
Yeah, he wanted it to be modern day. There was also a version of this where it was Iraq and not Vietnam, and it was just they were trying to do stuff to play with more contemporary things. I believe that one of the bigger Hayter things was the ending, the squidless ending, if you will.
Did he take it squidless?
He took it squidless, indeed. Yeah. So I think that there were bearing walls that allowed him to continue to have the screenplay credit. I'm not taking that away from him in any way, but I do believe that this adaptation is a lot more Alex and Snyder than Hayter. Right. And again, like I'm not trying to clown on Snyder here. I mean, it's I could talk at length about some of the issues I might have with him as a filmmaker, but I do think that he's fucking trying hard here. Like I'm not suggesting that this guy is trying to make a superficial adaptation of this work. I just think that for him, there's sort of the coolness factor that is just that seems very paramount to some degree. And I feel like the coolness factor of this sometimes overwhelms.
Yeah, I don't feel that at all.
And that's fair.
Yeah, no, I think this is a parody of that. I think that this is a lot closer to Fight Club than
Okay.
whatever I think you're saying, which almost sounds like Shane Blackian, which is it's these. I've read a lot of reviews, and I've like for whatever reason this is kind of a bête noire for me, this particular film, because I don't think people engage it with it a lot of the times in good faith. And for instance, people make fun of the music cues in this. You'd have to be, and this is not Zack Snyder, you'd have to be a cultural idiot not to recognize that every single song you've chosen in this is it couldn't be more on the nose.
I think the song choices are brilliant.
That's what I'm saying.
Particularly Hallelujah, which is the one that's most ridiculed. I think it's an amazing choice. And I think it really suits even coming at it from the source material. Because I'm sure we'll come to the scene later, but I'm going to say it now, so I'll be quiet later. Hallelujah is a song about bad sex, about not being good enough at sex, and about failed love. And there are two people who are only able to come together when they're in their stupid superhero costumes. And so it's like furries at a furry convention getting it on. And it's not meant to be this big romantic joining of two characters. It's two desperate people who are desperately trying to live their former lives together.
Not only that, this poor guy, the last guy she was with was God. So the idea that they're gonna have some kind of world earth-shaking sex is impossible. But we're saying the same thing, because there's nothing cool to me about using songs that have been used in these exact situations over and over again. This movie is about iconography. This movie is about deifying things that are not deities. And this movie is about what happens when you hand over all of your power and your psychological, energy to things that you can't control. So I think, and that's why I'm fucking crazy about the ending of this movie. And I think it's so much better than The Squid. I can't explain it. But that's what I think this is about. I think this is about the dangers of deifying things that are not deities. I think it's the danger of having parasocial relationships with things that that are necessarily parasocial. I think it's about losing control. I think that there's so much in here that changed in the 23 years between the publication of the graphic novel and the production of this film, that informed the making of this film, and where we, kind of wound up as a society. That is important. It's necessary not to look exactly like the graphic novel. So
everything that you said, I got from the comic, except for the squid. I got from the comic, but not so much from the film. The film didn't make me sad, whereas the comic, even thinking about it, makes me sad. And the film didn't. And I think it's because, and I have to preface this with saying, Zack Snyder, whether you like him or not, and I kind of do, is an amazing filmmaker. I mean, he has a style that is uniquely him. He created something, with whether you like it or not. 300, he changed cinema in his style, and you look at something and it's Snyder-esque. Now that's something that is remarkable, because very few directors actually get to do that. They have a word, Snyder-esque. He has a word, and you know what it means. Now that's entirely to his credit, but I think that is what stopped me from being sad watching the film.
I think that, part of, I'm not saying, Kenny, that what you're saying isn't there. You know what I mean? Like, I think the issue that I have, the wall I have ultimately with Snyder is kind of what Tom just alluded to. His visual style is so,
It's oppressive.
lacking in, it's oppressive. And I know that
it is.
And I do think that
It works for a movie about oppression, though.
yes. And I think that, no, sure. I think that watching it this time, I was really there was a real push and pull with me this time. I saw the film in 2009. I liked it fine. I think I liked it more than most people did.
Yeah, me too.
I kind of didn't really watch it again for a long time. It was just, it existed. I was happy. I owned it. And then periodically I would watch kind of the opening 20 minutes to a half an hour, from time to time, because it really does open like gangbusters. And I was, that would kind of scratch my itch. So the 2 hours and 45 minutes, I wouldn't say I watched, relatively often. And then obviously the show was announced. I think I watched it again around then. And I did try to I found myself continually reevaluating this, which I think is to the film's credit. I don't think I think there's a lot going on in the movie. I don't mean to suggest that there isn't. The thing that I struggle with is just the continual slow-mo, the sort of oppressively commercial slickness of Snyder does kind of take away something from me.
Yes. Well, how much it takes away, because it's not so much style over substance, because there is definitely substance in there. It's just the style is so big.
Yeah.
And to make the fight scenes as brilliant as they are brilliant fight scenes.
Mm-hmm.
The characters have to be superheroes. And the point is they're not. They're just people in costumes. With the exception of Dr. Manhattan. So there are examples would be Rorschach jumping up an entire story to reach hold of a ladder and pull himself up. And Night Owl and Silk Spectre to battling like they're Superman. Now, that's not the point of the characters. The point of the characters is they're just people and they're wearing masks, and they're able to look silly in that.
I take it a step further, though. They're not just people; they're psychopaths. They're the kind of people who, in a fight, don't just knock people over; they murder them. They break their limbs. They shoot them in places where their blood is all over the place, and that's the long shots on wounds and the long shots on exit wounds and the long shots on broken bones. I understand that people, and I think this has to do with Snyder's fan base. I understand that people look at that and say he is glorifying it, but when you watch that movie, the people who glorify that don't put the crunches in. You don't put the cracks in.
There's a quote from Snyder
in
regards to this that I think is worth reading. In an interview, he said that he wanted the violence in the film to be depicted as extremely as possible to make it completely different from the rather sanitized depiction of violence in the media. He reasoned that he wanted the viewers to catch themselves enjoying the gruesome scenes in order to make them wonder if something was wrong with them and that they may think about the violence in other films they're usually watching. I think that's all great. And in a vacuum, I would agree with you. I think in regards to this film, yes. The problem, unfortunately, is every film he's done since, where it's like every time he's glorifying, every time it's extremely violent, every time, and it's just like, I just think he thinks it's cool. I think that in particular to this film, I think in this film he's making a point. I think in future films he's lost the
Yes, I was saying it's very interesting to watch it now, having seen his Batman and Superman. Batman, killing people and shooting people and murdering people, which I know upset. I'm not a huge Batman fan. I'm not a huge superhero fan, but I know it upset a lot of people that he became a murderer.
Neck. Yeah, it's crazy. So it's not.
I'm telling you, there's a point here. There's a point here about these characters and the point here about the Justice League. I think that's interesting to me. This idea that we put all of this in this world, within the context of the DC universe or the context of the Watchmen universe or whatever, we put all of this faith and trust into these people who don't know. people we don't know, who dress up in costumes, who essentially are private police forces and who are more or less allowed to get away with murder. And we just think it's okay. I think I do think that, when you say Superman breaks a guy's neck or Batman kills someone and it's crazy, it's challenging. It is challenging. It is challenging our notions of good and evil. It is challenging our notions of deifying these superheroes. It is challenging this notions of like modern American gods, which I think is like Zack Snyder's big thing. I think, look, I also think the Snyder cut of Justice League was great. Like all 4 hours of it. I do think that he is doing something far more interesting than what most Marvel movies do. Not all Marvel movies, but most Marvel movies do, which is show the killing without the blood, which is show the violence without the screams.
This is my problem with a lot of the superhero movies now, is that I think I'd go so far as to say they're more irresponsible than a Tarantino film, because there's no consequence to the violence. And I hate violence on screen. I think it's unnecessary, explicit, strong violence. And particularly in Marvel films, they're beating the shit out of each other, but you don't see any of the shit that comes out of them. No. Everyone just pummels each other and then gets up and it's all kind of fine. And I think it's important, if you're going to show violence in films, you've got to show that it fucking hurts.
Yeah, the consequences, for sure.
Exactly. And I don't think Watchmen does that. I know that you see blood splattered and you see bones coming out of limbs,
arms,
but you see it in super sexy slow-mo with the color done in a beautiful way, and everyone looks fit while they're doing it. And so I think it has exactly the same effect as the Marvel films. I think it distances it from you when it's in slow-mo and you get the rain.
Sure.
And my God, Silk Spectre looks great and Night Owl looks fucking sexy. It doesn't really, and then you have moments like someone getting their arms cut off with a saw, and it looks to me like it's played partly for laughs. Mm-hmm. And so I think it still distances you from the consequence of violence.
Well, I think that you, sorry, just real fast, you and I, at least, I think are agreeing on what's happening. We're just disagreeing on the effect that it has on the audience. And my sense is it is gruesome, but there also is and I mean, I think this is a third thing I'm putting out there. The idea that the audience who is watching it is so desensitized anyway that that another limb, that another, decapitated person doesn't mean what it would have meant.
I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think that's an excuse.
I'm not excusing it. I'm sure. This is my point is it's I'm not trying to argue against myself. I'm just postulating something else. Is this idea of, well, how do you shock people in a culture that is unshockable?
Well, I don't think people need to be shocked. With this, I went back and looked at the comic for the first time in a long time after watching this, and specifically to go and look at the fight scenes, and they just seem really, really just miserable. And there's nothing cool about it. And when they end, none of the characters are, pumped up and we've just beaten the shit out of these guys. They look knackered. They look like it's been hard work. Night Owl is fat, and they look like real people who have just, they're a bit frightened. They look frightened. They look exhausted. All they can do is have sex with each other, thinking about Silk Spectre and Night Owl, because they've got to feel something other than this pathetic waste that they feel. But there's something really pathetic about the violence in it.
Sure.
Rorschach, one of the big changes after Rorschach goes to see Moloch, and Moloch's been shot, and it's the setup and the police are after him. In the comic, he doesn't battle against armed police. He does the flamethrower torch thing and he pushes a few down. But when he jumps out of the window, he breaks his ankle and he's on the ground trying to escape, saying, don't let the pain get you. And he's dragged off. He gets hit round the head by the police and they drag him off. And it's embarrassing. And I think that's the key, is make the superheroes look embarrassing. And then you'll show that they're not actually superheroes.
I think they do look embarrassing. I think that Night Owl is hilarious looking. I almost can't even believe how terrible he looks.
Do you mean because of the costume, though?
Because of the costuming, yeah.
But with this in the comic, it's Dan inside the costume, and it's inside Rorschach and inside Silk Spectre.
I think
that's embarrassing.
I think there's some revisionist history on Patrick Wilson, because Patrick Wilson in 2009 was not hot, of course, and now he's hot. Now he's a hot boy, and everybody thinks of Patrick Wilson as a hot boy. But in 2009, he was a prematurely balding character actor, and it was a very unexpected piece of casting. This wasn't we're finding the next hot guy. It was one step away from putting Paul Giamatti in the suit.
Really?
I don't know that it was that extreme.
No. I mean, was Patrick Wilson?
Patrick Wilson. I knew Patrick Wilson in 2009 from Hard Candy, where he played a creepy pedophile who Elliot Page.
But he plays a hot dad in Little Children.
Is he that hot in Little Children? He's a hot boy?
Yes, he's like glistening and fucking. He's literally called.
Was that
the prom
after?
king.
That was after Watchmen, wasn't it?
It's the same year.
Was it?
But yeah. But I mean, listen. My point. I want to just rewind real quick, because I do think that you're both making an interesting point about the fight scenes and about the slickness of them, because I think that Snyder is intentionally creating a situation of where both of you are conceivably right, which is that, there's an interpretation of, I am over glorifying this to show you how ridiculous this is. And then there's a version which I think is closer to what Tom and I have read, which is more of you're glorifying this and you're making this look cool, and there are people that are not going to get the commentary that you're making.
I don't care about those people.
I know you don't, Kenny, but I'm saying that the point is, if he's not making a crystal clear thing, then it's open to interpretation, a poor interpretation, because he's not making it clear.
It's Fight Club. That's not fair, dude. This is like this. This is a. It doesn't. It's not fair to be generous to a movie like Fight Club, and say,
I think I was critical of Fight Club. I think we were all critical of Fight Club, were we not?
We were generous towards David Fincher and his intention. And there's this notion of there are people who read this Fight Club incorrectly, and have used it to justify, fight clubs and violence and terrorism and all these, misogyny and all these things. And same with Matrix. With Matrix, we are very generous of what the Wachowskis meant, and the fact that it's used poorly by people who are saying the red pill and all those things.
Sure.
It's not fair to hold Snyder responsible for people who misread his work.
But he's directing it knowing that he will have that response from people. It's my trouble with that? For example, with Ricky Gervais. Ricky Gervais can make a racist joke or a joke about people with learning disabilities, and he knows that he'll get a laugh from racists and people who take the piss out of people with learning disabilities. Knowing that. And now he can say, but I'm doing it to laugh at those guys who are laughing. But he's still making them laugh. I don't
think that's a one-to-one comparison. I think that we talk about this a lot, because 1999, I guess really 89 to 2009, it was an interesting time for the white male director who is subconsciously or consciously aware of toxic masculinity's effect on the culture. And it's an open question as to how much of that is intentional in their work and how much of that is incidental in their work. And I think it's unfair to say Snyder's having his cake and eating it too, but Fincher isn't. Snyder's having his cake and eating it too, but the Wachowskis aren't. Matrix is the most beautifully shot violence in the history of cinema. They revolutionized the way violence is shot, and these people get their asses destroyed, and they are no worse for wear. Now, I understand that's part of the show, part of the the context of the movie. But what you got out of that movie were people who walked around, acting like characters from the Matrix, and then you had 25 years of irresponsible cinema that came off of that forgot the lessons of the Matrix and then just worked with the violence of the Matrix. I can't hold the Wachowskis responsible for that. I can't hold bad people who are bad readers, and I think this is happening to Snyder too. Now, the last point I want to make is this is a lot more difficult to pull off in the superhero genre, because now you have something like The Boys on Amazon, which is very obvious. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's very obvious. Like, these superheroes are actually the villains, and maybe that's the kind of level of satire we need in order to make our points. But I'm confident that was the point Snyder made here. I'm confident that's the point he was making in Man of Steel. He wasn't saying Superman's the villain, but he was saying this is a dangerous situation we have allowed to happen here.
I think that Zack Snyder is is obviously a divisive filmmaker. There's a lot of people online and offline and what have you that have thoughts about him as a filmmaker. I think that unfortunately he has worked a lot in the comic book space. That's the choice that he made. I agree with you, Kenny, that he has any number of intellectual ideas that he hopes to accomplish within that pantheon. I don't think he is as adroit or intellectual a filmmaker as the Wachowskis or as David Fincher. I think we can all agree on that. I think that that there is a little bit of misogyny that exists in some of his films. Whether it's a commentary on misogyny or not is obviously open to interpretation. I think that he was handed the keys to the kingdom at DC to do essentially whatever he wanted, because his films were attracting an audience and were working, financially speaking, even though, we're talking about the marginal success that this film had. I just think he is an interesting filmmaker. I'm not trying to take anything away from him on that front. I think that similar to Tom to a certain degree, feel like, I went to, a good example is I saw John Wick 2 in the theater, and I honestly wanted to walk out. Like, at a certain point, you're so pummeled with people's heads being blown off that it's just, and just gun violence. I'm not holding this necessarily against Zack Snyder, but I'm just saying, like, it can feel oppressive, and it can feel like we're losing the thread in terms of,
That's obviously not, and I know you're not saying this, it's obviously not Snyder's fault, nor is it the Wachowskis' fault, nor is it Fincher's fault, nor is it anybody's fault that John Wick exists. But it is the fault of critics who are uncritically looking at these John Wick movies. Sure. And just saying, my goodness, aren't these incredibly choreographed scenes of violence? And also, these are some of the best movies, of the last 15 years. Because those movies, John Wick, I've only seen the first one, is very much about the glory of violence and the way in which a violent man what he can accomplish in the society. Absolutely. Because he's good at violence. Yes. And there is absolutely no critical lens that the violence is put under in that movie. Sure. Whether or not you guys think he did it, which is fine, or whether or not you guys think that it was successful, I do think you guys at least acknowledge that there is a reading of this film, the reading
absolutely
that's there, and it's not particularly. To me, it's the obvious one, and I understand if it's not to you guys, but it's not that big of a leap to see this thread throughout his movie. Now, a lot of this for me is informed, and I'm probably telling on myself and getting into a bad place, but a lot of this is informed by the reaction to Sucker Punch as well. And Sucker Punch in so many ways was a misfire in terms of presentation. It was probably a movie Zack Snyder should never have done.
It's so close to being great, though, if I'm being honest. Like,
well,
I do feel like
that's my point.
I think I quite liked Sucker Punch.
I think if you're being very, if you're being, if you're looking at the movie,
I mean, it is a quintessential blank check. I'm going to make the movie my 14-year-old self wanted to make. But
again, like that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, I think that's the rap on it. I think the rap is like, this guy wants to put girls in compromising positions and, you know, give stuff.
He just wants to see hot girls kick ass with guns.
And look hot. Yeah. And I think people forget it's a fantasy told from the perspective of a young girl. Gaslit and tortured person. And about getting out of an insane asylum that she's been forced into. So there's and I'm not, again, this is like, we're getting into some extra textual shit that we deal with a lot. But like, should Zack Snyder be dealing with that material? Probably not. If the same movie was made by a thoughtful female filmmaker, it probably wouldn't be the same film, but that material is not unworthy of a film.
No, sure.
And that script is not unworthy of a film. And I think people engaged with that in bad faith because 300's a weird movie.
Listen, I think the overall thing, because I do want to get back to Watchmen specifically, but I do think the overall thing that's worth noting that I think we all can agree on is that, you know, Zack Snyder consciously wants to sort of run at taboos to a certain degree, wants to take down these sort of sacred, you know, idols that we, you know, idolize. And I think that that's a worthy endeavor. And I think sometimes he's more successful at it than others. I think that, you know, if I'm Zack Snyder coming off of the success of 300, which was an enormously successful film for Warner Brothers, which, as Tom mentioned, really kind of revolutionized the way that the graphic novel things, you know, certainly specifically sort of off the beaten path comic books, you know, were done. It makes sense. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to do Watchmen, right? Like it's the thing that no one's been able to do.
And then, yes, remind yourself of that the list of directors who tried and failed, and he did it.
Yeah, he did it. And I do think, you know, and obviously we'll get to rating this film at the end, but I do think that this film has quite the interesting arc for me in terms of my appreciation for it as I've watched it at different points in my life. And to Kenny's point earlier about seeing it through the lens of what 2009 was for cinema and this fulcrum point of franchises and comic books and what that and why this film is important in that trajectory, I think is also a worthy thing to sort of, you know, unpack. But I do just kind of want to give a little bit of context in terms of not necessarily a synopsis, because I'm sure if you're listening to this, you know what fucking Watchmen is about. But it opens on March 6, 2009, in first place ahead of Medea Goes to Jail, Taken, Slumdog Millionaire, and he's just not that into you, which is quite the box office.
Slumdog was the holdover?
Yeah, from 2008. It would go on to make $185 million on a $135 million budget. However, it made over $150 million on home video, which is pretty unbelievable, which is, again, an example of a different time, first and foremost. This film was released in a director's cut DVD, an ultimate cut DVD. There were all sorts of versions of this because I think that they knew that it, you know, this was a big fucking deal to a huge fan base that, you know, went to the theater to see this thing. But you're not going to get to $300-400 million in the theater based on people that don't know this property. So it did sort of, and it had, as we mentioned, a very long running time. After its $55 million opening, it finally crossed $100 million in its 21st day of release, setting the record for the slowest movie to $100 million after having a $50 million plus opening weekend.
It was kind of considered a failure. Which is interesting, you know, or at least
in theaters, a failure. Yeah.
It was it wasn't laughable. Like it wasn't like one of the, you know,
it wasn't a bomb.
One of those movies. It wasn't a bomb, but it certainly felt like this did not meet our expectations.
Well, because it did feel like, and I'm sure you felt this too, Tom. I mean, so in 2008, you got The Dark Knight that comes out. They put a trailer for Watchmen with Dark Knight. And this is really sort of like DC peak of their powers for all intents and purposes, right? Like they are, this is two of their biggest properties. The trailer comes out. It was a huge trailer. People were very excited for this thing. So I do believe that the expectations of what this was going to do and what this was going to perform, obviously it didn't meet them in theaters. But $150 million on video shows that this thing has legs. It shows that this thing had, obviously spoke to its fan base.
I do remember being surprised that it didn't do better at the cinema.
Right.
I do remember enjoying it. And I remember being surprised looking across the row in the cinema and seeing that all of my
friends had left.
Tom, when you guys were shooting the series, was the movie ever discussed?
No, I don't think it was. I spoke about it with Damon when I was offered the part. We spoke about everything to do with Watchmen, but no, it wasn't. When I told people who have no interest in comics that I was doing it, they said, "Oh, is that to do with the film?" No one really thought about the comics. They just said, "Oh, is that to do with the film with the guy with the big blue dick?"
Yes.
Well, your portion of the series is also very separate, right? Like it's kind of
also
literally
kind of
in a snow
connected
globe.
to the.
Yes, it is connected to Vite.
Yes.
It is connected to Adrian.
Yes.
But it is interesting that because the movie leaves Adrian in a place of sort of, I guess, existential crisis, kind of. I mean, he's successfully achieved what he wanted to achieve.
He won the movie.
He won the movie, right? But he also feels like a guy who is saddened by winning to some degree. That it took this to quote unquote win does feel like a little bit of an emotional loss.
I know that lots of people have written about how Vite in the film is shown just as a comic book baddie, and there's one line that he says, "Do you think I'm no comic book villain?" And people say, "Well, in the film he kind of is just a comic book villain." But I disagree with that. I think at the end, you do see that he was torn between.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that if there is something that probably, you take someone who's read the graphic novel, you take a lot into this movie. You understand about the relationship that these characters had before, Hero Wing was outlawed. And that you don't get that in the movie. You don't really get who Vite is in the movie. He is the villain of the piece.
Yes.
In a way that he's not in the
and it's only at the end that you see the argument that he's having with himself in his brain. And perhaps that's only spurred by Dr. Manhattan being there in front of him to encourage that.
I do think
for the rest of the movie, you do lose a lot of his charisma. You don't see that, you don't really get that he's the smartest and strongest man in the world. And they really push. There's one line in the comic where Rorschach, who is just an arsehole, he's just the worst fascist, deeply right-wing arsehole. When he's talking about Ozymandias in the diary, he says, at one point, he just says, off the cuff, probably a homosexual.
Yeah,
and they've really run with that in the film, in the, I think, quite brilliant slow motion opening credits to Bob Dylan.
Mm-hmm.
When the sort of first time you see Vite, he's outside Studio 54 with the Village People and shaking
Bowie.
hands with Bowie dressed in his Ziggy Stardust outfit, and they're really pushing. He's gay. There's I also saw that there's a little file when they break into his office, and they're looking at his things. One of the files just says boys. And so they're really pushing that he's maybe gay, and he's not the brightest, and he's not the strongest man in the world, other than by declaring it himself. Mm-hmm. He's purely there to twist his moustache until the end. And then
I do feel like Vite does get the short end of the stick, I think, in this adaptation, because in the comic, there's a little bit more. There's just more of him, and it's not to say that I. And
he's brilliant, and he's charismatic, and he's brilliant, and everyone loves it.
And he also is a surprising villain in the comic.
Correct.
I do remember being shocked at the end of that comic.
Well, because you feel the camaraderie in the comic.
That's right.
Maybe a little bit more than you do in the movie.
It really does feel like a band of 6 people who were forced to break up, and that's the thing that's what initially drew me to the graphic novel. I remember my friend telling me about it and saying it's a world where heroing has been outlawed.
Yeah.
And I'm, interesting. Okay. And I like the idea of this group of people who were together who no longer can do what they do. And what do they do now? Mm-hmm. So
I think that, it's worth noting just for a quick second here. Just I want to talk about the cast, because over the many, many years of false starts that this production went through, just a litany of names were thrown around for various characters. You had Sigourney Weaver as Sally Jupiter, Robin Williams, Daniel Craig, Simon Pegg, Sean Penn as Rorschach, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Dolph Lundgren, and Keanu Reeves as Dr. Manhattan. Tommy Lee Jones, Gary Busey as the comedian. just crazy. Again, this is what happens when you're developing something over 20, 30 years. You're going to have all these people obviously attached to it. I really do think that by and large, there's one performance that I would say is the weakest of the bunch. I don't mean to slag Malin Ackerman, but I do feel as though she, unfortunately, comic book dialogue, comic book exposition, it's tough to do. It's tough to imbue with a humanity, and I think she struggles with it. But honestly, I think that Jackie Earle Haley is an amazing Rorschach, just tremendous. I think Billy Crudup is a great Dr. Manhattan. It's not someone that I would have thought of.
Neither would
but just brilliant. Absolutely nails it, and part of it being the duality of like the pre-Dr. Manhattan to when he's John to when he's actually Dr. Manhattan. I think Carla Gugino is really good in this. Like I really do think Patrick Wilson's great. Like it's not a bunch of people that you would necessarily put in these roles, and yet I think they all really rise to the occasion.
There are a few I wish were recast.
Okay,
beyond Malin Ackerman, who I agree doesn't do what you need to do for that role.
I think what she does get, and I'm sorry to interrupt, I think what she does get is the sense of someone who's lost amongst these men. And I think that's really important. Yeah. She really manages to get the young girl who is just abused by men and idolizes them. And I think she does that terrifically.
Yeah. I do think that people, kind of do single her out. I actually don't think the comic does a lot of great work with Silk Spectre anyway.
No, agreed.
Or Silk Spectre 2. But that should have been leveled up a little bit, because she literally shows Dr. Manhattan that humans are worth saving.
No, for sure.
So
which doesn't it's tough. That's a perfect moment where I'm just like, I need to believe that he believes that the miracle of life is capable because of her. And
so that anyway. I also, there are a lot of people who I would have preferred as Ozymandias. And
go on.
Tom Mison, for instance. Maybe Jeremy Irons should have done it. Patrick.
In fact, in the show, and I thought Jeremy was, great. I couldn't stop thinking how cool it would have been if I kept thinking Iggy Pop would have been a great Ozymandias.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you know this, Tom, but the person that they wanted, the first choice for Ozymandias in the TV series was Rutger Hauer, and I think that
definitely a replicant.
But part of my issue with Matthew Good, and again, I don't mean to, slag Matthew Good, but he doesn't have the presence. Like in the comic, he's this fucking, like, he's a giant guy. You know what I mean? Like, he's a superhero. And in this, I feel like they try to bulk him up a little bit with the costumes and with the what have yous, but he's a slight guy. And I expect Ozymandias to just have more of a presence and more power. Maybe not even a physical presence so much.
It seemed to me as though he was playing Veidt with his cards held close to his chest.
Yeah.
And he was playing someone with secrets. Whereas
that's interesting.
Veidt is someone who projects as someone with no secrets. And I think that's the only sticking point. I like Matthew Good. I think he's great. But Veidt with his cards held close to his chest doesn't really work for me.
For me, it was always this idea of Veidt is first and foremost a brand manager.
Yes.
And part of it, so that would extend, in a very Trumpian way to every aspect of his personality. And I think, kind of the guy who realized you could monetize superheroes. He didn't play larger than life. He didn't play as a self-promoter. He didn't play as a comic book character, which of all the characters, he named himself Ozymandias. Of all the characters, which is an incredible name, but of all the characters, he's the one who is really cognizant of who he is in this world and what he's capable of. But yeah, But
then it also misses the irony of the name Ozymandias, that you're picking a name of someone who fails, of someone who isn't the immortal that he claims to be. The point of the poem that he finds a statue and it's destroyed.
Right. There's an irony in Veidt not being able to see that.
Quite.
But I did also love Jeffrey Dean Morgan. I thought
he was a very good comedian. Yes.
I think
that's spot on.
He is capable of doing young comedian and old comedian in a way not a lot of actors can.
Absolutely, and the charm of him is really tough because he is such a loathsome character.
He's the fucking worst.
He's the worst, and yet, so I don't want to open a whole Pandora's box here, but I do think it's worth noting or worth unpacking for a second.
Open it.
The comedian
What's in the box?
The comedian versus the Joker of it all, right? And by that I mean, and just this sort of twisted sense of humor that they exhibit. I think that there's something interesting in the nihilism that both of these characters have, and the way that it's sort of their approach to quote unquote humor. I think that the comedian, if anything, is maybe a more effective character, maybe because we haven't seen so many iterations of it. We've been sort of jokered to death, whereas the comedian feels so much more crystallized in terms of that idea. I don't know if you guys felt similar or not. Maybe not. I don't know. Yeah.
I think this is interesting too, because I did watch the film this time with the thought in mind that the comedian is Watchmen's version of the Joker.
Yeah.
But I think that the Joker over the last 15 years, since Dark Knight, I guess, has left this idea of being a quote unquote Joker and has become a lot more like Rorschach, as someone who's just kind of sickened by humanity.
That's interesting.
So I think that's kind of interesting and weird in its own way.
Yeah, the Joker used to be a stinker. He's not a stinker anymore.
That's right. Yeah. He used to be a stinker. And we just watched the original Batman and he was a stinker.
He's a stinker.
But he is not a stinker. Right. So I think but the comedian, I can't really put my finger on exactly who I think he is, because he is he's like a fucking, like a Blackwater gun for hire.
He shot JFK.
He's a mercenary. Yeah. And he's the worst. And he is like, the closest thing is like he's like a Blackwater soldier of fortune in Iraq type guy.
Yeah.
But who
I know
is
what you're saying.
Comics, like, I guess there are comic characters or people who kind of play both sides of the fence, like I guess a Venom does a little bit.
I never saw the Venom movies.
I get it. With the comedian, it's what happens when you put people in a mask and you say there are no consequences to what you do. And you probably remember the horrible stories after Hurricane Katrina, when there was no police force and people were allowed to do what they want, or they were free to do what they want. And the same thing happened here 10 or so years ago when there were riots in London and the police basically gave up on certain areas, and it was up to up to people to look after themselves. And the comedian is that. There's no consequence to what he does. And he is the very worst of what people are capable of when there are no consequences to what they do, which I think is one of the really brilliant things that Snyder achieves that was definitely there in the comic, of showing the very, very, very worst of the Purge style of human nature. And Jeffrey Dean Morgan is so good at that.
Yeah.
He's so good. You saw it in The Walking Dead with him as Negan. He's so great at that, whilst remaining compelling. That's what's brilliant about him as an actor, is that he's so compelling at doing it. It's your worst nightmares come to life.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like
which is exactly what I mean. It's what people are the worst thing that people are capable of. Or we know that he's just putting on a mask. To all of the other characters, he's the guy in the mask, but we know that there's someone underneath. We know that Blake is underneath.
Yeah.
And that's what's so terrifying about him. And that's why I think he's one of the most compelling. I wouldn't even call him an anti-hero. He's out and out a villain. He's one of the most compelling villains in comics and certainly in this film.
Well, I think
because it frightens me. It frightens me watching him. That
I think you're hitting
if something happens and we go into anarchy and there's no control in London or LA, how many comedians would come out?
The thing about the comedian that scares me is that, and this is why Blackwater scares me, is that they are available they're available to go to the highest bidder. That he has no morals whatsoever. And he is a true mercenary. But what I find really compelling about this piece is you're 100% right. He is the villain. He is a villain, but he is their adversary. He is their ally. They are like there is no vetting. There is no litmus test. Like, you put on a mask and you say you want to fight crime. You're in the Watchmen. That's the deal. And that's like, it's so interesting that the kinds of people that were brought together under this banner. I think like that's why I like the Night Owl characterization so much, because he's so ineffectual. He is such a ripoff of Batman to like an embarrassing extent, but on purpose. Like he is bargain basement Batman. He is bargain basement morality. He has like, even in the end,
he's got good in him. He still strives for good. I mean, I think there's a purity in him.
He's the only one, but he's not as rigid as Rorschach, who like at the end, Rorschach is a crazy person, a true psychopath, but he basically like, he can't stand the idea. He can't even fathom the idea of like killing 15 million people now to save humanity. Like that is too much for him, because he is so by the moment. This is the crime I see. This is unforgivable to me. Whereas like Night Owl just kind of sits there and be like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" But there's no move there. There's no I just feel like what I'm trying to say is like he in other versions of this, if you put these 6 characters together and gave it to a less interesting writer. Now, obviously, more created these characters, but you get what I'm saying. A less interesting writer, it would be the Night Owl movie, where Night Owl saves the world, because he's the one who's most like us.
For sure, yeah.
Or
who we want to be, the most who we think we are. Comedians actually who we are.
They're all
Sorry, Tom, but
they're all who we are, because that's the point. But like Night Owl's the one. Night Owl's he's the guy.
Yeah,
Dresses like a professor. He lives in a normal apartment.
Yes, and in the comic, he puts on the costume for the first time. He doesn't quite fit in, and he's a bit fat and a bit shit.
Yeah, he's a guy. He's a smart guy. He's a guy you can see yourself as. Like, you can never see yourself as Vite because he's too rich and smart. You never see yourself as Manhattan because he's blue with an enormous dick. But Night Owl is a guy you can see yourself as, and that is usually the guy. That's your Peter Parker. That's usually the guy who saves the day. And the fact that in the end he just sits there and whines and screams and loses, I think says a lot about your average, about what more, who like to me sounds most like Rorschach of anybody, but thinks about humanity. Like I think he really is.
I think Night Owl it does that because that's the moment he realizes he's not a superhero. He's just some guy.
Yeah.
Yep.
He lives it. The fact that he goes to visit Hollis Mason once a week, the former Night Owl, he's just desperate to be what we think superheroes should be. And at that point, he realizes, I'm just a guy and I can't do anything. And I love that moment in the comics, and I love it in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I Rorschach at the end, to your, which I think you're maybe referring to, I'm not sure, but like the very end of the film where Rorschach knows he can't keep his mouth shut, that he is incapable of not telling the truth to the people, and begs to be killed because of that, essentially, right? Like, I know that and I guess his diary probably fucks it all up anyway, but all that being said, I think that there's something, that's maybe one of my favorite moments of the film, quite honestly, is that detente, if you will, between Rorschach and Dr. Manhattan, and him taking off his face, his mask, and saying, like, fucking do it. Like, what are you waiting for? Like, you have to do this thing. And Dan's reaction to it as well, who's not in the comic, he's not there for that moment. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really powerful. Even just Dr. Manhattan, in the comic, when he kills Rorschach, he's almost like, yeah, okay, it's like I killed. Like he doesn't seem all that remorseful. In the movie, you do get the sense that he is remorseful.
The trouble is that moment humanizes Rorschach and turns him into something of a hero. Yes. And that's why you get the likes of Ted Cruz saying, when he's asked who his favorite superhero is, he says Rorschach. Rorschach,
which is nonsense for so many reasons, but yes.
That's what he said. That's what he said.
That's what he said. He was asked his favorite superhero. Oh yeah, Rorschach. Well,
what a shithead.
Like, what a piece of shit that guy is. It's unbelievable. Like, I mean.
You could have changed that moment in the film to, instead of humanizing him, he could have punched a kid in the face, and Ted Cruz would still have said.
I don't know if I don't know,
because that kid could have been foreign.
I think you squared the circle by the end of it, Phil. But I don't think that Rorschach is saying kill me because I can't keep my mouth shut. I think he's saying, the future, the past, and right now, what I'm going to do. And because I know what I'm going to do, I know what's about to happen. Yeah. What are we waiting for?
Yeah.
But I just want to say,
one of my favorite moments of my first conversation with Damon Lindelof was regarding Rorschach's journal. Because I said, 30 years on, what happened with that? Is that canon? Yeah. How many people? Yeah. Because he told me that there are people in Rorschach masks. And he said, it was just considered the ravings of a fucking lunatic, and no one paid any attention to it.
Yeah.
And then it was, around the fringes of the internet, and it.
Well, yeah, because like when you think about this,
it was
like the publication,
because he posts it to the newspaper people before he finds out about.
Right.
So it's just some guy talking, in bad,
just ranting.
About. In post sub Travis Bickle manner.
Yeah. It probably sounded like the fucking Zodiac. It's probably like the Zodiac ramblings.
Yeah. For real, Ted Cruz, who is the Zodiac killer.
Yeah, that's who Rorschach, I think, was to people. Rorschach, like, people weren't putting Rorschach posters on their walls. I think maybe after he died they were. But I wanted to ask you guys something. Phil, you having just watched Watchmen, and Tom, you having acted in Watchmen. Because this has nothing to do with the movie, but it's something I always kind of like, for whatever reason, when I watch the series, like I couldn't put the timeline together. When did Redford become president, and what happened for him to become president?
Well, like, in the comic, they say that Redford's going to run. And in the movie, they say
it's mentioned. It's on a newspaper in the background of one frame that Redford will run for president.
So the idea is he ran in '88 and won, and then was president until present day.
Correct.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Because Nixon had got rid of fixed terms.
No, I got that.
Talk about
but how did Nixon lose to Redford?
Because Redford's fucking Redford. Come on, who wouldn't vote for Redford?
Sure. I think it was interesting, just to get with that scene with Reagan, which reminds me so much of the Trump thing, because the editor goes, "We're not going to run some fantasy story about some cowboy actor." Yep. I distinctly remember, and I will never get over it, when the Huffington Post relegated all the Trump is running for president stuff to the entertainment section, saying this isn't serious, this is just entertainment, and this is where it should be. And in the moment, I felt like you guys don't get to decide. You don't get to, this is too serious to act like you are smarter than the moment and cuter and funnier. Take this seriously. This might happen. Listen to what he's saying. And it's funny because that was obviously in 2009.
Alan ruffled his hair.
Yeah. We'll ruffle his hair on the Tonight Show and it'll humanize him. Yeah. I want to just, there's a couple things or sequences that I want to talk about specifically in the film before we wrap this up. But I want to talk about the opening because I really think that, first of all, the sequence with what turns out to be Veidt killing Dr. Manhattan, Jesus Christ, the comedian at the top of the film, really sort of very crystal clear says, like, this is the Watchmen movie. We are taking specific frames from this thing. Like, this is going to be exactly the comic. And I remember being thrilled by that. To come back sort of full circle to what you were saying, Tom, about like how slavish should you be. But when you have this sort of beloved thing and to actually visually feel like it is coming to life in a way that you could never sort of imagined it could be, was really thrilling. To go right into what I would argue is one of the best credit sequences in terms of setting the stage, Bob Dylan, the times they were changing, playing over that.
Good.
Right? Like, you're just like, I remember sitting in the theater for that first, I mean, I guess ultimately it ends up being about maybe 10, 15 minutes of screen time and thinking, he did it, right? Like this is going to do it somehow. Now, I mean, obviously I have my issues with some stuff that came after that, but it really just opens so unbelievably well that you really do think, if you're a fan of the comic and you watch that 15 minutes and you're not like, well, this is going to do it. It's really pretty unbelievable. I would even go even farther past the credit sequence to Rorschach's introduction. I love the constantly changing mask of the sort of the ink blots on his face. That whole obviously his VO, his whole sequence to going up to the comedian's crime scene after his death, and everything pretty much up to that point is really pretty spectacular. Then you get other stuff that happens, but I really do feel
it also doesn't feel like the opening titles to a film that's nearly 3 hours, because they managed to fit so much into such a short time that you completely know the world, and it's brilliant. And that's what's so phenomenal about it.
It is the most thrilling fucking
opening
title sequence I've ever seen. I remember the movie just being blown away. The song was perfect, and at the time, those superimposed graphics were new too.
Yes.
So that looked so cool too. Awesome. The whole thing felt so fucking fresh.
It did.
Snyder-esque. It's Snyder.
100%. It was, and that I think is another thing worth noting too, because I felt like, obviously, Dawn of the Dead, but to a certain, but 300 is like, that is he's planting a flag. That is Zack Snyder being like, this is my style. It's a huge movie. And this feels like the continuation of that. This feels like anything's possible for this guy when you're watching sort of the opening of this film.
And look, I can use color too.
I can show different colors. I also want to say, in terms of the slavishness to the source material, the Dr. Manhattan flashback sequence, that whole which is essentially an issue of the comic, is spectacular. It is everything you want it to be in terms of, again, a perfect distillation of.
It's beyond words good. It's beyond words.
I loved it as much now as I did the first time around. Yeah.
And I also love those 80s retro,
Yes.
the couple of TV sets they use. I love the fake Charles McLaughlin in the beginning. It has a very specific sense of place and time, but not 1980s real life, 1980s in this comic book world, which is so
Absolutely.
cool. I mean, like, again, it is 20 years after Burton's Batman, but it is that kind of world building that we just don't get today. We don't think movies in general, comic book movies in general, feel like they take place in our world. And that's because that's the way Marvel rolls outside of Wakanda. That's just the way it is. And Wakanda's its own thing and looks Guardians into Space. That's Star Wars. But like, what it's not even a comic book movie. It's a space opera. But like and I guess Asgard too has its own kind of feel. But for the most part, when I think of Marvel, I think of New York City.
Yeah.
And
this, I mean, again, it's worth noting, and I
the real New York City.
This movie is a $135 million movie shot mostly in Vancouver, which you would never fucking know. I mean, this is a spectacular production from top to bottom. I mean, there's over 1,000 computer generated sequences in this film. It holds up unbelievably well. Now, 2009 wasn't that long ago, but still, like, there are films that were made back then that have not aged as well as this film has from a production perspective.
Phil, have you been to Vancouver?
I actually have not been to Vancouver.
Tom, have you been to Vancouver? I would imagine you've shot
there. I hear there's a lot of yoga.
I have been to Vancouver, and it is surreal how much it feels like New York City when you're in
really.
Oh, interesting.
It is surreal. Like, because it's almost like it wasn't, but it was almost like it was built as a writ large film set to double as New York. It's crazy. Like you got to do it. Like the streets are wide enough. The architecture is the same in so many places.
That's really funny.
It's an incredible kind of mind blowing experience because you're still in the Pacific Northwest. You're on the ocean. Like there are beautiful mountains in the background, but you get on the city streets and you wouldn't know the difference.
We nearly went for Sleepy Hollow, but they thought for something set in New York, they
go to Atlanta.
Vancouver didn't have enough Spanish moss and eternal sunshine.
Just absurd, just absolutely ridiculous. But I will say the only department in this film that I might give some shade to is the makeup department. The Nixon makeup, the old aging up makeup. It's very cartoony.
It's like Dick Tracy.
It is, and unintentionally, yeah. But that that's neither here nor there. I do think that the Nixon stuff, by and large, falls a little flat for me. It feels like a poor man's Dr. Strangelove in a lot of ways. But
again,
there's not
when
much
I was
of it, so.
when I look back at the comic after watching it, all of the War Room stuff, it didn't look like the Dr. Strangelove War Room. So that was intentional.
Yes.
To look like it would, fast kill people, and for what that's worth, whether the film benefited from that or not, I don't know that it did.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't know.
I would like to see a Watchmen that is entirely naturalistic. I'd like to see it without the slow motion and without the prosthetics and the War Room.
To that point, Tom, I would say that of all the directors that touched upon this production over the years, the one that I might be the most interested in seeing is actually the Paul Greengrass version of it.
Yeah.
And I don't say that's not to say that, Michael Bay or Darren Aronofsky or Terry Gilliam, I'm sure they all would have been very interesting. Nothing to take away from that. Greengrass's might have been the most grounded and the most sort of, it just might have been really interesting. It also might have been super. I just genuinely don't know what that even looks like. So that's interesting.
No, it's fascinating.
I would have voted for Aronofsky. I think that would have been really wild too. I wish he did it once because he's flirted with superheroes so many times.
I think he might tell you that Noah is a superhero movie, but that's neither here nor there. But I agree with you, Kenny.
He
100%.
probably would. But no, I don't like the Bourne movies, so Greengrass isn't really my guy.
No, I get it.
What?
Yeah, I don't like the Bourne movies.
Kenny doesn't like any spy movies. Doesn't like anything espionage.
Well, I like Live and Let Die. Or what did we watch?
We watched License to Kill.
License to Kill. I like License to Kill. I've softened on Bond to some extent, but outside of Bond, most spy movies that take place on the European continent bore me to tears.
Amazing. So,
Kenny, watch the 1980 BBC series of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with Alec Guinness as George Smiley.
Well, it won't bore me to tears?
Oh, it'll bore you to fucking death, but it's brilliant.
No, it's like the Bourne
It
movies.
didn't bore me. I love it. I think it's one of the best. That and Smiley's People, which is the sequel, I think is in the top 5 best series ever made.
I will watch it for you.
You'll be bored. Fuck you, Kenny. You'll be bored.
I don't mind being
Fuck
bored.
you.
The Bourne series.
he doesn't mind being bored.
The Bourne
Bourne,
series.
you don't like Bourne.
My eyes glaze over, and I can't even begin to recognize that a movie is happening in front of me. It's like here's how little I can explain this. I've seen all 3 Bournes in the theater. Because again, much like the Mission Impossible series, which I also do not like, I keep feeling like I'm supposed to like these movies. So I should keep giving them a shot. I can't tell you what any of these movies are about. I am sitting there in the theater and it's happening and I'm not, but they are so incredibly unengaging to me that I can't even be critical of them. Because I don't know what happened. I can't be like, I don't like it because of this or that. I don't like it because I was not paying attention.
So I to kind of sort of wrap this up, I want to just talk about the last part of this film, which is Squid versus Atomic Bomb. I, similar to Kenny, I left the film thinking, yeah, obviously the atomic bomb is the smarter play. I mean, it makes more sense, right? You pin it all on Dr. Manhattan, this, that, and whatever. I've now kind of come full circle, and now I'm Team Squid. I just think the Squid is preposterous in the best way. I understand all of the intellectual notions that are packed into the atomic bomb ending, but for good or for bad, I'm now Team Squid. But Kenny, I know you're Team Atomic Bomb, so let's.
I would never call Team Atomic Bomb. I would call Team Dr. Manhattan. I think tying it back to one of our characters and going full circle into the notion of this is what happens when you have a Superman.
Yep.
Is a lot more powerful. And I also just remember, and this might not be popular, not being not feeling left cold by the Squid when I read the comic book, and trying to because I really loved 98% of this graphic novel, and then the Squid happened, and trying to justify to myself and to others why it was brilliant. And
yeah, I get that.
I see the idea behind it, and I still think like if it were a Squid at the end, it would have been done, or it could have been done in a way that would have been satisfying. But making it Dr. Manhattan blew me away. Still does blow me away. Still feels like that. Like Squid is the bad pitch, and Dr. Manhattan's the good pitch that you get to. It's just that's
seeing
just
the Squid in the Watchmen series look pretty fucking dope.
It was awesome.
Oh God!
Don't get me wrong. Like don't get me wrong.
Really
like
satisfying.
But the way they played it through, was Jonathan Majors was the young version. Who was the young version?
Of who? Sorry.
Of
Timberlake Nelson.
No, wasn't it wasn't the black character in Flashback was the when we saw it, wasn't it the episode with the mirrors and the carnivals? It was all the Flashback episode.
That was young. It was young
Tim Blake Nelson.
Yeah, it was his flashback. It was
okay, yeah. Okay, so seeing it through that perspective, through an on the ground perspective,
it was
from
so fucking cool.
what the fuck is happening was amazing.
Yeah.
But as
and
a villain,
fucking shot, the pullback,
it was
just
that
unreal.
episode is the fucking most brilliant thing. But
it's awesome.
And the whole fucking show, it's the best. Like Tom, the best. Yeah. But
and that was a surprise to me. I hadn't read that. I stopped reading the scripts because I was so separate. I stopped reading after about 4 episodes because I was loving what I was reading so much. I wanted to be surprised when I watched it. And I never ever expected to see the squid attack. So to finally see it on screen was like Luke coming back at the end of The Mandalorian. It was such a beautiful surprise.
So at the so as a
I'm Team Squid, by the way.
As an on the ground terrestrial thing, the squid is amazing. As a villain plot, it leaves me cold. That's it.
And by the way, it's funny you bring up the villain plot because I'm reminded of the scene when Veidt in the series is on trial for the squid, and they have like the drawing of the squid, and obviously, Tom, you are the judge, and then they freak in a new jury that's just a bunch of pigs that then say he's guilty is amazing. And so I do need to ask.
I was the only person who handled that pig who wasn't shat on by that pig.
Oh.
Well, there you go.
Now, listen, I was nicknamed on that the Pig Whisperer after that because everyone, including the person whose fucking job it is to look after the handler, whose job it is to look after the pig.
Sure.
Anyone touched the pig, it squealed. It screamed. It was like it was in Deliverance. And it shat on me.
His first TV show? Come on, pig, get it together.
But you know what? You come to Tom Mison, I'm going to give you a warm embrace. I'm going to whisper it's all right to you.
Oh, God, that's so sweet.
And we loved each other. It had no name. But
can I ask you a technical question, Tom? Because I've been wanting to ask you actually for quite some time. The multiplication of you, because there are many of you in this series. It's done seamlessly. But are you are performing all of these different things, or how does that even work? That
was trial and error, really. Okay. We went through various different ways. The first idea was they did a full cast of my head, and they made masks. It didn't get so far as for me to see someone with my mask on. I saw the mask, and it was fucking terrifying.
See if you get one of those. I got Halloween coming up.
And all of the extras apparently putting them on, it was like Leatherface. It was terrifying.
There's no way that was going to work.
Never going to work. So they took then a 3D scan, and all of the extras had dots on their face, and they put it on. And apparently, because we had such an amazing effects team, it looked really good, but not quite as good as the show deserved. For other shows, it would have been fine and they would have done it, but they wanted, Tim Blake Nelson's Mirror Hood was entirely effects.
Yeah.
And there were other people calling Eric, our head of effects, saying, so what material did they use to get the mirror effect? Because they didn't believe that was done in post.
So cool.
So, when you've got people like that, they don't want it to look like a computer game. So in the end, Sarah Vickers, who played the other clone, Miss Crookshanks, and I went back to Atlanta for 3 days, and every single shot where there was a double of us, they then had to sit us in front of in a green screen, and they had to relight and reposition the camera for every single other person. And we got, so it was actually our heads on theirs, which for me, that was the best way to do it because.
Yeah, it it looks amazing, but
And
it
it
sounds
works.
painstaking in terms of from a digital.
It was the most
joyful.
joyful experience of my life. I loved every second of it.
I just mean from a post perspective, not painstaking on your part, but just like to actually render these things. I mean, Kenny obviously, knows in terms of some of the shows that he's been a part of, just in terms of the simplest visual effects are an enormous pain in the ass. Yeah. And to do it unbelievably well, like it was done on the show, is tremendous. But
yeah, they were amazing.
I can't believe Tim Blake Nelson's Matt. I didn't know that.
it's incredible, isn't it? It's incredible.
I was just looking at pictures of it. It seems insane.
I mean, this is the thing about, and this kind of brings it full circle as far as I'm concerned too, in terms of, the show is able to exist not just because of the world that we live in now and the impetus of Damon's entry point into it and all that, but it exists because this movie exists too, right? Like it's sort of, I don't want to say it's playing off the movie, but the movie did the comic in order for the show to exist in its own way outside of the comic. And
the movie didn't blow it.
Right, exactly, right? Like the movie didn't blow it. And I think that watching it this time, I was thinking, maybe the movie's too slavish to the book, and it might very well be. But I also think that because we have the series now, which is able to be so fresh and so new and use the book as a jumping off point and the movie as a jumping off point, we get the best of both worlds as far as I'm concerned. I mean, and that's what's one of the myriad of things that's so wonderful about the show, is that it allows us to have our cake and eat it too. It's really it's really spectacular. Obviously, I need to tell you that. You obviously know that, Tom. But.
And I love that the most powerful superhero in comics history is now a woman of color.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, that's the other thing too, where it's like when it was over. I'm sure I speak for you as well, Kenny. I was just like, I want more. Obviously, I would love there to be another season, but I also understand first and foremost why Damon doesn't want to go back into that, that sandbox, and why if I was, why anyone would want. No one should do it. Like it's the perfect ending.
I'm perfectly happy with that being the ending for now, and then 10 years, give me something else, because there's so much there. The other thing he proved is that there's so much meat on this bone, on these bones. So.
I'd like to see a show about all of the people who tried to be in Watchmen, all of the people who put on costumes, who spent months and months building their costumes and thought, I'm going to go out and be a superhero as well, and then just got punched in the face by a robber and went home and didn't do it again.
Yeah,
it's about the group of people who tried to do it.
So
preferably British.
I want to rate this film.
I have another question for you, Tom.
Yes, please. Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Go on. Oh, God.
Was there any character you played in The Watchmen that wasn't a clone? Was there an original you somewhere in there?
Yes, in the John Osterman flashback. So you saw Dr. Manhattan before he became Dr. Manhattan, John Osterman. You see him as a child, escaping Nazi-occupied Europe. And he goes via England. So back then, wealthy families with huge estates would take refugees as a halfway house between Europe and America. And they would help with getting visas and getting access to the ships to then eventually go on to America. And so the clones are based on the Lord and Lady of the Manor that Osterman and his dad went through to get to America.
So that's OG.
Yeah. Okay. And so in the flashback, the wartime, you see me and Sarah as Lord and Lady of the Manor. And that's who, when there's one frame in the comic where Dr. Manhattan, it's the very last conversation with Veidt. And it's still in the film, except he says it to Silk Spectre instead, when asked about life, and do you hold life with such little value? And he says, no, I'd like to go and create some of my own. I'm paraphrasing. And so he goes off to Europa and creates Tom Mison.
The original Adam.
Yeah. That's pretty good. That's pretty fantastic.
That's fantastic.
It's because Tom Mison is the simplest form of human.
or most complex. Really,
He's the
one or the other.
prototype.
Really
That's
one or the other.
the prototype.
So what you go first, Kenny? What did you think about this in 2009, and where are you now?
I'd say in 2009, I was about an 85. I really liked it, but look, it's a 2 hour and 45-minute movie, and I had a limited attention span, and it was midnight. And before this podcast, I was going to give it an 89. I really turned it off, being like, very much a fuck yeah, that's a masterpiece. And after this conversation, I'm at a 91. I actually think
We've done nothing to change his opinion. If anything, bolstered it.
I thought you guys liked it. I think this movie might wind up actually playing into my 52 in review for 2009.
I'm sure it will.
Because I think 2009 is an interesting Oscar year, and it's just interesting prestige movie year. And
what happened in 2009?
Well, it's a good Oscar year.
It's a good Oscar year. Yeah.
What was it?
Serious Man, Hurt Locker, Avatar.
Oh, and Secret in Their Eyes, the Argentinian film, won best.
Yes, I believe that was 2009. As is An Education is 2009.
Inglourious Bastards, District 9, and Up in the Air, and it was a lot of interesting films that were vying for Oscars, but
Precious.
A lot of interesting films that I'm not like.
Was this nominated for anything? Any effects?
Technical stuff.
I think technical stuff. Yeah.
But I think that this movie is important. I think this property is important. I think this movie does a good job of kind of translating it for a more mass audience. Obviously not the masses, but I think more people now are familiar with this stuff, and it certainly asks some really important, interesting questions and presages some stuff that I think has happened. So 91 for Watchmen.
Okay, so in 2009, I saw this opening weekend. Certainly wasn't at midnight. I don't think, anyway. And I remember, quite liking it. I probably would have given it a 70 back then. I thought it was, I thought it was good. But it was also kind of a beast of a movie that, as I've mentioned, I have not watched all the way through all that many times since. Before the podcast, I have to say I was a little less enamored with it this time around through this lens. So it went down to a 65 for me before the podcast. However, I do feel like this conversation has bolstered it again for me, and now I'm at like a 79 or an 80. I do think it's a very good movie. I do think it is unquestionably my favorite Zack Snyder film.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that it's it's such rich text. It's such rich everything. It's, I would also say, and I didn't mention this earlier, but, we've seen many iterations of the quote unquote fake comic book heroes, if you will. The Boys is doing that relatively, is doing that now. This is the only one that works. Yeah, Mystery Men. This is the only one that really works for me. I know that it's doing a spin on stuff. You mentioned Night Owl being a Batman sort of thing, but this is its own thing in a way that I can't say any of those other stuff has done as effectively for me personally. So I'm at I don't know. I'll say I'm at an 80 for this. That's where I'm at. Tom, what about you?
Back then, 80. Watching it again, now that I'm more interested in esoteric, pretentious asshole films, and I can withstand far more pretentious and I like Tarkovsky now. It's gone. Sure. It would have gone down, but then back up again after this. Kenny, you're quite persuasive, and sorry, I meant Phil. You're quite persuasive.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, Tom. Yeah.
And so I'm gonna just be a spineless coward and bounce straight back up to 80.
There you go. I feel like, truly, I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, it's been a wild ride with this movie, and I think that it will continue to be, which is a good thing. I like that this film hasn't been static for me, because I don't feel like the graphic novel has been static for me.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate how difficult this was to get made. And hats off to Snyder for just pulling it off. Mm-hmm. When some of my favorite directors ever, Terry Gilliam is one of my favorite directors, definitely an auteur. Tim Burton, an auteur of types. Aronofsky, an auteur. Michael Bay is fucking Michael Bay, and none of them managed it.
Yeah.
And Snyder
Gilliam
did.
said it was unfilmable. Gilliam.
Yeah,
threw
he
up
was
his
like,
hands.
"You can't make this." Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
Not only can I not do it, nobody can.
but I do think that, and not to reiterate this, but I do think that it really was a perfect kind of planets aligning for Zack Snyder, for DC, for Warner Brothers, post Dark Knight. Like, all this stuff felt like this was the opportunity to do this thing, and they did it. And that's why I think this year is interesting too. I mean, when you think about where Marvel has gone, when you think about where DC has gone since 2008, 2009, it really is this is kind of the fork in the road. It's interesting.
And also the script, the book is difficult to read, let alone say out loud and be half plausible. The script has done a brilliant job at taking the bulk of the comic and bringing it to the screen. And the actors have done an amazing job of taking something that is so difficult to say, and they say it, and I enjoy it, and I can sit through it for 2.75 hours.
It's tremendous. Well, Tom, we thank you so much for coming on.
Tom, you're the best.
I love you guys.
Tom's the best. From Cruel Intentions to Watchmen. It's been we can't wait to keep.
We're bookended by rape.
Well, I'll just say this. We look forward to having you on for a less
That's pretty much
movie
50-50 shot with American movies, though.
That's true. That's true. But Tom, honestly, this was a blast. And obviously, we can't wait to have you back for something in the future.
Preferably not French and Beau Travail.
Well, I thought we were doing Beau Travail.
He can't wait. He's super excited. It's his favorite movie.
All right, Beau Travail.
Beau Travail. We'll see you then.
I love you guys.
Beau Travail. Bye-bye.
Love you too.
Podcast like it. You want a podcast like it. 19